Picture a Saturday afternoon, backyard, warm enough that people have shed their jackets. Someone rolls up their sleeve to pass a plate. Another adjusts a short-sleeved shirt. A woman laughs and pushes her hair back, and there on her forearm is a delicate line of script. The guy next to her has both arms covered from wrist to shoulder. His girlfriend has a small geometric piece behind her ear. And then there is you. Clean arms, bare skin, nothing. Somebody notices. They always do. The look crosses their face for just a half second. Surprise, curiosity, maybe even a flicker of suspicion, and then they say it. Wait, you don't have any tattoos? You shrug. You say no. You move on. But something stays with you after that moment. Not embarrassment, not regret. Something quieter than either of those. A question you have never quite been able to answer out loud. Why didn't I ever get one? Because the easy answers don't fully satisfy. It wasn't the pain. It wasn't the money. It wasn't that you disapproved of other people's choices. Something else stopped you. Every single time. For decades. And that something else turns out to be one of the most revealing things about how Generation X is psychologically wired. In this video, we are going to trace the real psychology behind that quiet, repeated no. Not to celebrate it, not to defend it, but to understand it. Because what it reveals about identity, permanence, and self-knowledge is genuinely worth paying attention to. Here is the part people miss when they talk about Gen X and tattoos. You were not protected from this. You were there when it happened. Generation X watched tattoos make the full journey from biker bars and military arms into shopping malls, college campuses, television screens, office break rooms, and eventually onto people who file noise complaints against their neighbors on a Wednesday morning. You were the bridge generation, young enough to have full access to it, old enough to remember when it still meant something specific. According to Pew Research, roughly a third of Americans now have at least one tattoo. Among Gen X specifically, that number sits around 32%, which means that most of you don't have one. Not because the opportunity wasn't there, it was always there. So why did the majority of a generation that lived through the entire tattoo revolution quietly step back from it? The answer involves 6 layers of psychology, and the 6th one is the one almost no one talks about. The first layer is the one that stopped you earliest, and it has nothing to do with fear. You are 22 years old. You are sitting in a tattoo studio, and someone slides a book of designs in front of you, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice asks a question. Will you still want this when you are 40? Most people brush that voice aside. You couldn't. You sat there and tried to picture who 40-year-old you actually was, and you realized something that most 22-year-olds don't have the self-awareness to admit. You had no idea who that person was. You didn't know what they would find embarrassing. You didn't know what they would value or regret or look back on with a wince. You thought, I am not making a permanent decision on behalf of someone I haven't met yet. That is not indecision. That is an unusually honest relationship with change. You had already watched yourself transform several times over. You had been completely different at 15 than you were at 22, and you had enough data on yourself to know the data wasn't stable. Tastes changed. Opinions shifted. The person you were absolutely certain you'd be at 30 turned out to be someone you barely recognized by the time you got there. Tattoo regret research confirms what your instinct was telling you. Studies consistently show that people who get tattooed at younger ages are significantly more likely to regret their choice later. Roughly 1 in 4 tattooed Americans say they regret at least one of their tattoos. And the pattern is clear. Younger age at the time of getting the tattoo is the strongest predictor of later regret. The 22-year-old version of you that you didn't fully trust, statistically, that instinct was correct. The second layer goes deeper, because it wasn't just about your future self. It was about what you noticed happening around you. You watched the waves come through, the tribal armband, the lower back piece, the Chinese character that was supposed to mean strength, but may have meant something closer to soup, the Celtic knot from someone whose most Irish experience was a green beer, the dolphin, the dream catcher, the infinity symbol with a word written through it, the matching couple tattoo gotten the week before the relationship ended, the barbed wire that nobody talks about anymore, and you noticed something uncomfortable. A lot of people were not choosing from the inside. They were picking from the air around them. They walked into a room full of designs, chose a personality off the wall, and called it self-expression. That bothered you, not because you judged them, that was never really your move, but because you recognized something. Once something became a trend, it stopped being a choice. This is one of the most well-documented psychological traits associated with Generation X. Marketing researchers have consistently described this generation as having an unusually high resistance to group enthusiasm. You weren't just skeptical of advertising, you were skeptical of momentum itself. Whenever a large number of people started rushing in the same direction, your instinct was not to join, it was to slow down and ask why. The tattoo industry was one of the first major cultural tests of that instinct, and most of you passed it without even framing it as a test. You simply watched, you noticed, and you held back. Here is something the other videos on this topic consistently miss. Choosing not to get a tattoo when everyone around you is getting one is not a neutral experience. It has a social cost. There are moments that stay with you. A partner who showed you a design they loved and quietly hoped you'd want a matching one. A group of friends who all got inked together after a concert and invited you along, and you said maybe, and then didn't. The group photo where every arm in the frame had something on it except yours. There is a specific kind of social pressure that comes not from anyone saying anything directly, but from the accumulation of small moments where your absence is quietly visible. And for a generation that already had complicated feelings about belonging and standing apart, that pressure was real. Most Gen Xers who never got tattooed can point to at least one moment where they almost did, where something flickered, where a design felt right for about 48 hours, where the door was open and they stood in front of it for a long time. And then the feeling passed, the door closed, they walked away. Not because they were weak, but because they trusted the passing of the feeling as much as they trusted the feeling itself. That is a form of emotional discipline that most people don't develop until much later in life, if they develop it at all. For many Gen Xers, it was simply how they had always operated. They let the impulse arrive, they observed it, and they waited to see if it was still there in a week. Usually, it wasn't. Psychologists have a concept called costly signaling. The idea is that people demonstrate genuine commitment by making choices that require real sacrifice, pain, money, irreversibility. A tattoo is a costly signal. It says, I am committed to this. I am willing to make it permanent. I am willing to put my body through discomfort so that the world can see it. But here is what rarely gets said. Your blank arm is also a signal. It is just a quieter one. It says, I have not found anything yet that I trust enough to make permanent. I am still open. I have not finalized myself. I am keeping the door unlocked on who I might still become. A 2012 study comparing tattooed and non-tattooed individuals found real psychological differences between the two groups. People with tattoos scored higher on extroversion, sensation-seeking, and the desire to appear unique. People without tattoos scored higher on conscientiousness, meaning they were more careful, more deliberate, and more cautious about visible, permanent decisions. Neither group was wrong. They were simply wired differently. What the data captured was this: the non-tattooed person is not someone who has nothing to say. They are someone who has not yet decided to say it on their skin, someone who is still listening, someone who suspects that the most interesting version of themselves hasn't fully arrived yet. That is not emptiness. That is patience. There is another layer that runs underneath all of this, and it connects to something much older in the Gen X experience. Many people treat the body as background scenery. They live in it without really thinking about it as something that belongs to them in a specific, irreplaceable way. A lot of Gen Xers never did that. This generation came of age watching adults struggle with economic instability, institutions that broke their promises, and the quiet disappearance of security they had been told was guaranteed. Jobs vanished, marriages failed, financial certainty turned out to be more fragile than anyone had admitted. Through all of that, The body was the one thing that remained yours unconditionally. The bank couldn't take it. The company couldn't eliminate it. The relationship couldn't walk out the door with it. That created a different relationship with the body. Less canvas, more equipment. Equipment you don't modify on impulse. Equipment you don't decorate because a trend is moving through. Equipment you treat with a baseline respect, not because you're precious about it, but because you understand that you have to drive this particular car for the rest of your life. And you are not going to do anything to it based on a feeling that might not last the month. That is not vanity. That is practical stewardship. And it is one of the quieter expressions of a generation that learned early that you are ultimately responsible for the things that belong to you. But here is the part that deserves honesty. Not all of it was wisdom. Not all of it was principled restraint or psychological sophistication. Some of it for some people was something harder to name, a discomfort with being fully seen, a reluctance to make a visible claim about who you were, because making that claim would mean you had decided, and deciding meant you could be judged, and being judged meant being known, and being known for a generation that grew up learning to be self-sufficient and self-contained could feel more vulnerable than anything else. The same instinct that protected you from impulsive decisions also kept certain parts of you permanently private. There is a version of the unmarked arm that is wisdom, and there is a version that is armor. The honest answer is probably that for most Gen Xers, it was both, sometimes in the same moment. That is worth sitting with, not to turn it into a problem, but to see it clearly. Because the goal here was never to make a case that not having a tattoo was the right choice. The goal was to understand what it reveals about how you are built, which brings us to the sixth layer, the one that requires stepping back far enough to see the whole picture. Look at what happened with the generations that came after you. Millennials embraced tattoos more openly than Gen X, but still with some of the same underlying ambivalence. The meaningful placement, the symbolic design, the tattoo that honored something real. Gen Z moved differently. For many in that generation, the tattoo came early, openly, sometimes on the neck or hands or face places that previous generations considered deeply significant decisions. Not because they were reckless, but because they were navigating a world where identity felt genuinely unstable. Social media meant their image was constantly circulating beyond their control. Their biography was visible to strangers at all times. Identity itself had become a moving target. A tattoo, in that context, was a way of nailing something down, of saying, at least this part is real. At least this part is mine. At least this part is fixed. Gen X didn't need to nail it down because they grew up with a self that was allowed to be private. Nobody was watching. Nobody needed proof. Identity wasn't something you broadcast. It was something you built quietly through repeated action and accumulated experience. You became who you were through what you did, not through what you displayed. That is the real difference. Not courage versus fear, not wisdom versus impulsiveness. It is two entirely different relationships with the question of what identity is for. Gen Z used permanence to anchor themselves in an unstable world. Gen X stayed blank because they already had an anchor that didn't require display. The blank arm and the tattooed arm were both answers to the same question. They just came from completely different places. Here is what all 6 layers point toward when you pull back far enough to see the shape of the whole thing. When tattooed people are asked why they got their tattoo, the most common answer involves pointing at something, honoring someone, remembering a time, marking a version of themselves they wanted to preserve. The tattoo is a signpost, a visible, external object that holds a piece of identity outside the body where it can be seen and confirmed. Many Gen Xers never needed the signpost, not because they had nothing meaningful in their lives. They had losses and loyalties and experiences that cut just as deep as anyone else's. They had people they would never stop thinking about. They had years that changed them permanently. They had music that saved them at moments when nothing else could reach them. None of it needed to be written on the outside to be real. The meaning was already inside. It had always been inside, and putting it on the skin would not have made it more true or more permanent. If anything, reducing it to a symbol felt like it would have made it smaller. That is one of the most underrated psychological traits in this generation, a stable, internal sense of self that does not require external proof, an identity that can exist without being announced, a life that can be full without being displayed. In a world that has spent the last 2 decades asking people to perform themselves at increasing volume, the bio, the feed, the sleeve, the brand, the Gen X generation that quietly kept its blank arm may have been holding on to something genuinely valuable, the ability to still be a surprise, to walk into a room and not have told everyone what you think before you've spoken, to carry a history that strangers can't read off your forearm, to remain in some essential way unfinished, not because nothing is happening, but because the most important parts of a person have never required a caption. So the next time someone at a gathering notices your unmarked arm and asks that question, the slightly surprised, slightly confused, "Wait, you don't have any tattoos?" You will have a longer answer available to you, even if you don't use it. Because the real answer is this: you ran a different algorithm. You took permanence seriously. You trusted the feeling of the impulse passing more than you trusted the impulse itself. You watched the waves of trends arrive and break and recede, and you stayed on the shore. You kept the canvas blank, not because you had nothing to say, but because you hadn't yet decided the skin was the right place to say it. And 30 years later, you are still deciding, which, for Generation X, might be exactly the point. Here's the question worth leaving with. The interesting question is no longer why you never got one. You understand that now, at least a little better than before. The interesting question is whether you ever will, and what your honest answer to that question tells you about where you are now, about how much you have changed, or how much you haven't, and whether the version of you sitting here today is finally the one you'd trust to make a permanent decision on behalf of the rest of your life. Think about that. If this video made you think about something you hadn't put into words before, that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Psychology Aspect is built around one idea: that the most important things happening in your life already have a name. You just haven't heard it yet. If that resonates with you, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Every video on this channel is made with the same care and depth you experienced here today, and there is a great deal more still to come. If this particular video connected with something in your own experience, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, whether you have tattoos, whether you don't, or whether you are still somewhere in the middle of deciding your perspective is worth sharing. And this community is a better place for it. Thank you for spending this time here. It is not something I take for granted. I will see you in the next one.